The next device that I'd like to talk about is contrast change. And contrast change is the idea that objects appear to lose contrast the farther away they are from us. Now, to some degree, this is a function of atmosphere. But it also occurs in outer space. I mean, stars that are 500 million light years away are much dimmer than those that are closer. But primarily because we live in a world of atmosphere here on Earth, we see things in this depth of space because we are surrounded by this atmosphere. Now, in this composition by Claude Lorrain, a view of the Temple of Delphi, notice that the objects that are up close, the figures, the trees, the stones, the walls, the difference between light and shadow is represented with values that have a lot more contrast than those values that are used to represent objects in the distance. Notice how much more contrast the artist creates between light and shadow in the foreground compared to the difference between light and shadow in that Temple of Delphi in the middle distance. This helps to create a great sense of space between the foreground and the middle ground. Also notice that not only is there a loss of contrast within each object, but there's also a dramatic decrease in contrast between the objects themselves that are up close and the distance that they're fading into. That sunset, that sort of gold, hazy, sunsetty distance. Notice that those trees right in the middle of the painting are so much darker and really advance ahead of that deep distance. And that as things get farther and farther away from us, they appear to fade into that sort of like that golden atmosphere. And he uses that sort of silvery quality to create a poetic sense of the time of day for this painting. And here, in this painting by Thomas Cole from 1837, of a view of Florence from San Miniato, notice how much more contrast there is in those figures on the wall and in the wall itself, by comparison with the Duomo, the cathedral, in the middle distance. The artist uses much more difference between the values in the foreground than he uses in the middle distance, and this helps to create a sense of space. And then as objects get farther back, they lose all contrast completely and become almost perfectly flat right before that sunset sky. Notice how the hills really do seem to almost fade completely into the sky by comparison with those in the middle distance, where we can see some difference between light and shadow. And then again, with this Magritte painting, Golconda, notice that there's a great decrease in contrast between the values that are used to represent the businessmen up close by comparison with those in the distance. Also notice that those businessmen appear to fade into that blue background, so they become sort of bluer and grayer the farther away they get. In this detail from Hieronymus Bosch's Garden of Earthly Delights, we can see that the figures in hell get smaller the farther they are away, but also they get darker. They fade into a dark distance. Now, the examples that we've looked at so far, we could see things fading into a lighted distance, a brighter distance. Here, Bosch has things fading into a dark distance. We can have things fade into whatever value distance we want in order to create whatever mood we want. But if we're creating a deep space and we're using contrast change, then things should lose contrast in the direction of those values that are in the distance. So there's less and less contrast here, and things get darker. In the previous example, there was less and less contrast, but things got lighter. Probably the weakest of the space indicators, placement. And placement is the idea that things that are lower are closer, and things that are higher are farther away. Down is out, and up is in. And we perceive this primarily because we live in a world of gravity. And in our field of vision, that's how we maneuver. We don't even think about it. As we're walking through a room, Those things that are lower in our field of vision are closer. We avoid them. Things that are farther away are higher up. And artists will use this perception in their paintings to create a sense of space. And we can see that here in this example by Wayne Thiebaud from 1963, his painting of cakes. Notice that the cakes that are lower are closer to us, and those that are higher are farther away. Now he is using some overlap, but primarily he's using placement to create the sense of space here in this relatively shallow space, but a very convincing space using placement. Also in this composition by Yves Tanguy from 1927, called A Large Painting Representing a Landscape, he also is using placement primarily to create space. Those forms in the foreground are lower, and those ones in the middle ground are higher, even though the contrast and the size is about the same. He's primarily using placement to create space in this very surreal, dreamlike painting. And in this painting of the Church Street L by Charles Sheeler from 1920, he's using placement almost exclusively to create his space. Notice that the railroad tracks stay about the same size, the same distance from each other, and the contrast stays about the same from foreground to background. There is some overlapping, but primarily down is close to us and up is farther away. Down is out and up is in. Primarily, placement is being used here to create a sense of space in this very abstract composition. Artists and movie directors, they know about this placement idea, and so they will use that. Sometimes they'll do the opposite. And here, in this opening scene from a sci-fi classic from 1983, we can see the director having this starship come in from the top of the picture and getting farther away the lower it gets, just the opposite of what we have seen so far. And what this does is this disorients us and lets us know that we're not in a world of gravity anymore. We're in outer space, where that perception of things being lower, being closer, and higher being farther away is no longer the case. And so by reversing placement, the movie director is able to create a sense that we are disoriented and floating somewhere in outer space. So those are the four major space-making devices or techniques or conventions that artists have used over the centuries to create the illusion of a three-dimensional space on a two-dimensional surface. Now, some artists, knowing these techniques, knowing these devices, will use them in sort of paradoxical and creative ways to create startling images. And so here, in this print by M.C. Escher, he's using size change and overlap to completely disorient us. As we look through one arch, we're looking up. And as we look through another arch, we're looking down. And then when we look through the arch in the middle, we're looking straight across. And so we sort of get completely disoriented, and yet he has created a very coherent space using size change and overlap, but at the same time, it's a very paradoxical space. And in this painting by René Magritte, called The False Mirror from 1928, by using overlap, he is creating a very disorienting image, whereas the sky, which is up and away and far away, is placed behind the eye. And he's able to make that sky be behind the eye by the use of overlap, creating sort of this very startling, original, surrealist image, which is very provocative, very thought-provoking. So those are the devices that artists use, or have used over the centuries, to create a sense of three-dimensional or an illusion of three-dimensional space on a two-dimensional surface. And the way some artists take those same devices and use them in sort of creative, paradoxical ways to create startling images, creative images. Well, thank you for watching this video.